I had always loved my ranch. It wasn't huge, but it was mine, rolling pastures, old oak trees, and a small creek that sparkled under the sun. Every morning, I would wake up before dawn, pour myself a strong cup of coffee, and walk along the edge of my land, just listening to the birds sing and the wind rustle through the grass. It was my sanctuary, my escape from the noise of the city, my piece of freedom. I'd grown up dreaming about this place, saving every penny for years, and finally one day it was mine. I would tell anyone willing to listen that owning this ranch wasn't just about having property. It was about peace, independence, and the pride of knowing that no one could tell me what to do on my land. Things were perfect until the first letter came. It was from the HOA, something I never thought would affect me here in the middle of nowhere. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I had moved here to avoid their meddling, but apparently their reach was longer than I imagined. The letter was polite at first glance, but underneath the formal wording, I could feel the thinly veiled threat. They claimed that my ranch's entrance violated some obscure regulation. Encroachments on private road easements, they called it. They demanded I remove part of my fence that I had built decades ago and threatened fines if I didn't comply. I laughed when I read it the first time. Me, in trouble with an HOA? I had lived under city rules before, and this seemed laughably minor. But the more I read, the angrier I got. They weren't just asking politely. They were demanding, threatening, and implying that they could enforce these rules without my consent. For a moment, I tried to reason with myself. Maybe they had a point. Maybe I should just move the fence a few feet. But then I remembered the morning walks, the creek, the quiet evenings, and I realized I wasn't going to give up my ranch's freedom for bureaucracy. Over the next few weeks, the HOA escalated. They sent inspectors, wrote stern letters, and even showed up on my property unannounced. One afternoon, I watched from the porch as their representatives walked through my pasture, clipboards in hand, measuring and taking photos. I had never felt so violated. They weren't just inspecting. They were trespassing, trying to assert power over a place that had always been mine. My blood boiled, but I didn't act rashly. I knew I needed a plan. Reacting in anger would only make them think they could intimidate me. Then came the neighbors' complaints. I had thought living here meant peace, but it seemed some people had aligned themselves with the HOA out of fear or convenience. They whispered about fines, about legal action, about how we all have to follow the rules. It was infuriating. I realized then that the HOA wasn't just about rules. It was about control, and they thought they could control me. One evening, I sat on the porch as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across my ranch. I sipped my coffee and let my mind wander. What if I didn't comply? What if I found a way to turn their own rules against them? I smiled at the thought. I wasn't going to let a group of self-important administrators decide what I could and couldn't do. I wasn't going to be bullied. And that's when the plan started to take shape. The first step was simple: document everything. Every interaction, every letter, every unauthorized entry. I bought cameras, recorded conversations, and made a meticulous journal of their actions. I needed proof that they were overstepping their authority. While they thought they were intimidating me, I was preparing my counterattack. And as the days passed, their arrogance grew. They built a small barrier at the entrance of my ranch, thinking it would make me flinch. But all it did was make my determination stronger. I spent nights studying local property laws, easement rights, and HOA regulations. I wanted to understand every loophole, every technicality I could exploit. It was thrilling, like a game I had to win. The more I learned, the more I realized how vulnerable the HOA was if challenged correctly. And that's when the idea hit me. What if I could turn their own presence on my property into a source of income? What if every time they tried to assert control, I could benefit instead? I didn't act immediately. I waited, observing, listening, planning. Every time their trucks drove onto my land, I felt a spark of possibility. They thought they owned the authority, but they didn't own me. And soon, they were going to learn that lesson the hard way. But little did I know, the next encounter would be the spark that ignited the fire, the moment where everything changed. The calm before the storm was ending, and the storm itself was about to hit. I just had to be ready. After weeks of careful observation and planning, I was finally ready to act. I had everything documented, every visit, every letter, every unauthorized footstep on my property. I knew the HOA thought they held all the power, but power is only meaningful if it goes unchallenged. That day, I decided it was time to show them that the ranch belonged to me and that I could bend the rules in a way they never expected. The HOA had built a small barrier at the entrance of my ranch. It was crude, but intimidating, a physical reminder of their so-called authority. I stood on my porch, looking at the barricade, imagining their smug faces when they realized it wasn't me who was intimidated, but them. I had prepared a sign, something simple yet effective: private property access fee, $50 per entry. I placed it next to the barrier, knowing it would provoke a reaction. The next morning, their first truck pulled up to the gate. I watched through binoculars as the driver noticed the sign, eyebrows shooting up in shock. A few moments later, they radioed headquarters, no doubt reporting my outrageous demand. I chuckled. They had no idea what was coming. When the driver hesitated, I walked down to the gate, calm and collected, ready to negotiate. "Good morning," I said. "If you need to enter my ranch, there's a $50 access fee. Cash or check works." The silence was palpable. I could see their minds racing, trying to figure out if this was legal, if they could threaten me, if they could call the police. But I had done my homework. Every law, every easement, every loophole I had studied gave me the upper hand. I was untouchable. Slowly, they handed me the money, muttering under their breath, but there was nothing they could do. The ranch belonged to me, and I was reclaiming control. Word spread quickly among the HOA members. Some laughed nervously, some fumed with anger. But soon, every time they needed to enter the property for inspections, meetings, or routine checks, they had to pay. It was surreal. The same people who had tried to intimidate me were now literally funding my ranch operations. I never imagined satisfaction could feel this sweet, to watch them begrudgingly hand over cash every single time they stepped onto my land. I also started to notice the subtle changes in their behavior. They became hesitant, anxious, and less bold. What had once been a position of authority now felt like a privilege, and I was the one controlling it. Their confidence crumbled, and the power dynamic shifted completely. My ranch was no longer just a piece of land. It had become a symbol of victory, of resilience, and of standing up for what's rightfully yours. But even as I celebrated, I realized that I needed to maintain my vigilance. The HOA was not a single individual. It was a network of people who could scheme, sabotage, or try to reclaim their sense of control. I reinforced the fences, updated the cameras, and even got legal counsel on standby. Every detail mattered. Every small victory had to be protected, and I was determined not to let them take even an inch of control back. It was around this time that I started noticing another pattern. Some neighbors were watching me closely. Were they impressed by my boldness or plotting against me in secret? It was impossible to tell. That uncertainty added another layer of tension. Every day became a delicate balance of asserting dominance without provoking retaliation that I wasn't ready for. And here's the question I want to ask you. What would you do if an organization tried to control your property unfairly? Would you play by their rules, or would you find a way to turn the tables like I did? Think carefully, because sometimes standing your ground can change everything. The next move would require more cunning. I knew the HOA would attempt to challenge my fees legally or come up with a plan to bypass my barrier. That's when I decided it was time for the final stage. To make my ranch untouchable and ensure that no one could ever challenge me again. But I had to wait for the perfect moment, because in conflicts like these, patience is as powerful as strategy. Little did they know, every step they took onto my property now worked in my favor. Every complaint was recorded as proof of harassment, and every attempt to undermine me only tightened my grip. I had turned their arrogance into my advantage, and the story was far from over. The ranch had become my fortress, and I was ready to defend it at all costs. The weeks turned into months, and the HOA had learned a bitter lesson. The ranch was no longer theirs to intimidate. Every attempt to bypass the access fee or challenge me legally ended in frustration. I had everything documented, their letters, their trespasses, even their angry phone calls. Every move they made reinforced my position, proving that they were overstepping their authority and that I was fully within my rights. The balance of power had shifted entirely, and it felt incredible to finally breathe freely on my own property again. One afternoon, I received a letter from the HOA president personally. It was thick with legal jargon and implied threats about court action, fines, and even public complaints. I smiled as I read it. I had anticipated this. I forwarded the letter to my attorney and prepared my response. Everything I had done, the fees, the cameras, the careful documentation, had built an airtight case. I didn't just have the law on my side. I had the evidence to crush any challenge. For the first time, I realized that standing my ground could completely change the way people respected your boundaries. The next day, a group of HOA representatives showed up at my ranch, trying to negotiate in person. They looked nervous, hesitant, and almost guilty. I greeted them calmly, and they shuffled their papers, clearly unsure how to proceed. I reminded them politely about the access fee and the documented violations of my property rights. They argued, they complained, and they tried to intimidate me, but it was useless. The entire situation had reversed. They were now the ones begging for permission to enter. I had one final trick up my sleeve. I introduced a simple system. For every visit, they had to schedule it in advance and submit a fee up front. No exceptions. The very organization that had once tried to bully me into compliance was now following my rules. It was poetic justice in its purest form. The barrier I had once seen as a point of contention became a symbol of empowerment, reminding me every day that knowledge, preparation, and courage could overturn even the most entrenched authority. The neighbors who had once whispered about my defiance now watched in awe. Some tried to emulate my strategy. Others kept their distance, not wanting to challenge me. And the HOA? They eventually gave up attempts to challenge me altogether. Over time, my ranch became known as the one place where standing up for your property rights actually worked. I had not only defended my land, but also established a precedent. You can't intimidate someone who knows the rules and refuses to be bullied. As I sat on my porch one evening, sipping coffee and watching the sunset over the pastures, I reflected on everything that had happened. It hadn't been easy. There had been tension, sleepless nights, and constant worry about what the next move might bring. But it had been worth it. My ranch was my sanctuary again, stronger and more secure than ever. I had turned the tables completely, and the sense of victory was sweeter than I could have imagined.